Hello, I do have a presentation. Let me share my screen. Mhm. Slide. So, my presentation is part of a paper that I wrote in a class a while ago, and I'm circling back to it because I would like to include it in my dissertation. So I would, after my presentation, I'd appreciate any feedback of any avenues to kind of expand and kind of go from where I'm talking about. But yeah. Hello. As I was introduced, my name is Chelsea Yuipco. My paper is called Horror from Within, an exploration of the role of zombies in Carlo Ledesma's Outside. Oops. Okay, so in 2024, Netflix released an original film directed by Carlo Ledesma called Outside. The film follows the Abel family as they escape the zombie outbreak in the city, traveling to the patriarch's, Francis, his child home, where the film slowly unearths the level of childhood trauma Francis associates with his home. You can kind of see that in this movie poster here, where this man here is Francis, and this is his childhood home, which I'll talk about later is a hacienda. Um, More on that later. But the Abel family is no happy and healthy family, the film reveals as Francis's wife, Iris, shown here, seems miserable with their two sons, Joshua, the oldest, and Lucas, the youngest. So as the family knows this. As it turns out, Iris had cheated on Francis with Francis's older brother Diego, who Francis has a brother complex with because of his childhood abuse and neglect. Joshua, it is also revealed, is Diego's son. With zombies roaming around outside the plantation and the hacienda, the real horror of the film is revealed to be the consequences of distrust, and intergenerational trauma resulting in Francis's spiral to madness and then his ultimate death. Outside is marketed as the first Filipino zombie movie, yet many viewers of the film critique the film's zombie element as, quote, so unnecessary, with the film's main focus being on, quote, too many scenes of characters just staring at each other with an absurdly long delay between pieces of dialogue, unquote. Filipino film reviewer Joe Balunbin also notes that the film, quote, loses touch with what makes the zombie category resonate in the first place, acknowledging that the film tries to do something different but feels that it is a walking corpse, shambling without a pulse. Despite these reasons, I can't help but still question the relationship between the seemingly unnecessary zombies and the rest of the film. Why use a zombie apocalypse in the first place if zombie films are so uncommon in the Philippines anyway? If the film required monsters to begin with, why not draw from the various monsters from Filipino folklore, such as the aswang, the duende, or even the corpse-eating undead monster Amalhing? Why even have a monstrous figure in the first place if the role to the plot is overall insignificant? With these questions in mind, this paper seeks to explore the role of zombies in Outside, the movie, through an examination of the figure of the zombies as well as the zombies' relationship to space and place, such as the hacienda that is central to the film's setting. I argue that the zombie serves as a means to make hidden and repressed traumas more legible to both the characters in the film and to viewers outside the film, both domestic and international. The existence of a zombie, though, named as such rather than any other Filipino mythological monster, I argue, also points to the colonial trauma that haunts the land in the film, which parallels the psychological horror of the family trauma that the film works through. To begin my discussion, I'll first talk about the role of zombies in Western culture and its history in relation to the monster folklore in the Philippines. In the West, monsters in culture and media offer a space where society can safely represent and address anxieties of its time. In the 21st century specifically, monsters in media have gained popularity because of how they represent collective social anxieties over resisting and embracing change, and can be read as a response to rapidly changing cultural, social, political, economic, and moral landscapes. The Philippines, too, has seen the way of monstrous representation with its undeniable aswang-dominated construct, fixating the idea of Filipino folklore, wherein there has to be a creature or a monster that somewhat represents our anxieties and fears relative to the issues of our society. Zombies in particular in the West have come to represent all kinds of anxieties, notably contagion and plagues since the pandemic, but also other anxieties such as consumerism and terrorism. While zombies are popular in the West, especially in America because of Hollywood, countries with different cultures around death make it hard for zombies to be popular there. Thailand, for example, cremates its dead, rendering the existence of zombies impossible. What little zombies in media Thailand does have, though, has instead found its way into Thai media by representing the horror of viruses being transmitted by foreigners. Similarly, in the Philippines, the existence of zombies in the way that Hollywood represents them seems unlikely. After someone dies, a burol, which is like a funeral, is held and can last up to 2 weeks or more. Additionally, the body is held in a glass-covered casket and is constantly watched and monitored by a family or community member. Because the corpse is being constantly watched for days, the Hollywood imagery of an undead corpse rising from the grave randomly is not very compatible with the Filipino imagery of the undead. Rather, the Visayas, a region in the Philippines, have their own form of zombies, a malhing. One form of malhing are aswang, who died with their monstrousness, which caused them to reanimate and kill humans by biting their necks, much like vampires rather than eating human brains like zombies. However, as we see in Outside, the zombies do not seem to be a malhing. The first zombie we see in the film is Francis's mother. At first glance, on the left here, she looks relatively normal and alive. She's upright, although very disheveled, and she even speaks. She says sorry. After her apology, we hear her breathe shakily, but when she turns her head, which is this picture on the left, we see her eyes are black and there's blood all over her mouth. She apologizes again and turns toward Francis, but as she tries to take a step toward him, she splits in half, then tries to lift her upper body up, apologizing again. And that's what the second picture is. Here we realize that she is a zombie. The imagery of a zombie here is more closely aligned with what Hollywood imagines a zombie to be, minus being able to breathe and speak coherently. Because the Philippines is its own country with its own culture and mythologically different from Hollywood and the West in general, it is no surprise that the type of zombies that Outside depicts has its own Filipino spin. Following the Western zombie representation, the zombies in Outside also represent contagion in this movie specifically. It's implied to have come from an infection through the water, which Ledesma makes especially clear in an interview. The more Filipino aspects of the zombies, though, include doing a lot of smelling and a lot of hearing. Smelling being a part of Filipino culture when greeting loved ones, like sniffing specifically. Additionally, another element of 21st century monsters that Outside follows is the position of humans as the monsters and framing the monstrous creatures as sympathetic. To do this, Ledesma had the zombies say the last thing they said before they got bitten. His logic is that, quote, because usually in most zombie films, they're not talking anymore. Mas monsters na sila. These creatures still have a glimmer of humanity in them, unquote. And he's mas monsters na sila means like they're more monstrous. Knowing this, in introducing Francis's mother as the first animated zombie and having her say sorry, the audience cannot help but feel sympathy for her rather than fear. The moment between Francis's mother and Francis serves as a stark juxtaposition to the rest of the film when we see that the monster has become Francis, whereas the zombies are so peripheral, they are more at the back of our minds. As such, the zombies in the film are stylistically not the center of the marketed zombie movie. Despite this, I argue that the existence of the zombie still inadvertently serves a larger purpose of pointing to the trauma within the film, but specifically the trauma related to colonization. Before its Hollywood fame, zombies represented slavery and potential for rebellion and liberation in Haiti. Because of this and its connection to the Haitian Revolution and America's taking of the monstrous creature, zombies and its history are inherently linked to colonization. As Sarah Juliet Lauro writes, the zombies' history is one that can be reconstituted only by sifting through the literary fragments of empire. History is written almost entirely by colonial oppressors, slaveholders, and the French and Spanish monks, and chronicled in the exaggerated travelogues of curious travelers. Yeah. With the Philippine centuries long history of colonization, the zombies in the film also serve to represent and embody the monstrosity of colonization. While the film overtly showcases family trauma, the audience sees the history of colonization through the setting. We first see the relationship between zombies and colonization through the zombies' existence, forcing people to move from the city to elsewhere. There's a lot of tension in the Abel family about where to go. Francis wants them to go to his childhood home on a sugarcane plantation, while Iris and Joshua want to go to the mountains. Ultimately, though, Francis takes them to his childhood home. As he drives, the camera shows different shots of sugarcane fields, and eventually the plants thin out to reveal a hacienda. Because of the plethora of sugar canes and the hacienda, the audience becomes aware that the film is set in Negros Occidental, which was central to the sugarcane industry in the Philippines up until the early 1970s. The lack of zombies in the area, though, as far as the camera shows us, and the Abel family and us were led to believe, make the plantation a safe place. Finding safety on a plantation, though, provides an unsettling juxtaposition between the hacienda being a safe haven away from the zombies, but having a history of being a colonized force left over from both Spanish colonization in its introduction and American colonization in its use for sugar for the US. Not only are the sugarcane plantations historically not really a safe haven, as Francis pulls up to the hacienda, we also see that he doesn't truly view his childhood home as a safe haven either. When Francis goes to the basement to check the generator, we get a hint as to why he seems so fearful. His family had abused and neglected him. Here, through the use of the zombie apocalypse, the film introduces two kinds of trauma haunting both the land and the family trauma and the trauma of colonization. While there are no zombies present on the hacienda, Kirsten Olaf writes that irrealist registers tend to cluster around description of the cane fields that hide unspeakable horrors, the sugar mill that threatens to gobble up lands and people, and, as we've seen, the experiences of alienated workers. Olaf then continues and explains that zombies are very obviously inscribed in the larger crisis of capitalist, colonial imperial ways of farming, translated into brutal and racialized labor regimes with devastating environmental consequences. They register feelings of alienation as well as racial tensions. It is not the presence of the zombies that is important to the horror of outside, but the memories that haunt the land and the family. Additionally, part of the trauma is that the land primarily haunts Francis, who has prior memories attached to the land. As Vincente L. Raphael writes, remembering as haunting both entailed appropriation of what comes before oneself, in both temporal and spatial senses. They are ways, therefore, of localizing what is outside of one. Through this, we see a relationship between the land haunting the characters, specifically Francis, and how it relates to self inside and outside. In introducing his family to the land, he then introduces them to the trauma that will then haunt them as well. After Francis has Joshua grab a key from the dead groundskeeper, Francis finds a sugar cane and gives it to Lucas. He calls it candy, hacienda style. In doing this, Francis passes down the wealth he grew up with. To call it candy separates the sugar cane from its history of exploitation, which serves both as Francis' attempt to sever his own ties with his past trauma and as a way to point to a lack of appearance, which in this case is the privilege of ignoring a history of exploitation. What Francis tries to ignore and repress, though, comes back to haunt not just him, but his whole family, with the intergenerational wealth. With intergenerational wealth comes intergenerational trauma, both of which we see Francis passing down to Lucas later in the film when he, so paranoid after Joshua leaves, locks Iris and Lucas in the basement where he had been locked up so many times as a child. When Francis first encounters the generator at the beginning of the film, we see a flashback to his childhood, but when we see the generator after Iris and Lucas are locked in, Iris immediately turns to Lucas. While Francis is haunted by his past, Iris and Lucas are not. Yet Francis passes down his trauma to them, becoming the agent of trauma that traumatized him as a child. Here again, there's no sign of zombies, following Ledesma's intention of focusing on monstrosity of humans instead. I have a couple more minutes left, so I'm gonna kind of go down to where there are stuff I wrote about zombies. Give me a sec. Okay, sorry. Well, the lack of zombies on the plantation hacienda pointed to the existence of colonial intergenerational trauma. The horde of zombies on the bridge toward the mountain points to the physical haunting of the present traumatizing time of a zombie apocalypse. When Francis humors Iris's desire of trying to go to the mountains to take refuge, the family discovers a military checkpoint in the road on the bridge, separating the land with the plantations and the land that goes to the mountains. After Iris makes too much noise trying to hack through the barbed wire gate, a horde of zombies appear. The audience learns that all of the zombies in the world outside can speak and say the last thing they said before they got turned into zombies. There are military personnel repeating, "Pass, please," over and over again, and citizens who had been trying to pass a checkpoint screaming, "Let me by," over and over again. Well, the moment when these people had turned into zombies passed, repeating their last words over and over again haunt the present, allowing the audience to piece together what could have happened. Zombies must have attacked everyone at the checkpoint, while the military personnel would not let them through without a pass. Or maybe the military personnel did not have time to let the civilians in. Additionally, the existence of the barrier, the horde of zombie haunts, separating the plantation lands from the direction of the mountains, points to a history of the land and the people. On the one hand, it haunts the present because it stops the Abel family from continuing. On another hand, the memories unearthed from the haunting are that of the civilians who are trying to escape from the zombies from passing. And on another hand, the military presence at the bridge, a junction between plantation and mountain, points to the Philippines' history between the government and military with the NPA, New People's Army, in which perhaps the mountains are rumored to be a safe haven because the mountains are where many NPA are found to have been hiding. This haunting that points to the conflict between the Philippine military government with the NPA also points to the history that led to this conflict, its roots in colonization, and how it led to the Marcos administration period. In this scene, we see that through the zombies, the land is haunted by a history of military conflicts. On top of that, the zombie attack further made Francis feel justified in hiding in the hacienda rather than figuring out how to get to the mountain where he is trying to hide his family from Diego, who he fears might take his family from him. And this is Francis' trauma response from his childhood. I guess to wrap it up, in conclusion, the role of the zombie in Carlo Ledesma's 2024 film Outside is larger than just a means to an end. The zombies act as a haunting figure to connect the characters, like Francis, to the past, um, both Francis's past into the past of the plantation, which is a past riddled with memories of exploitation and colonial violence. In the absence of the zombies, additionally, we are left with the notion of the monstrosity of the human, yet we also see the connection between Francis as a monster and the hacienda as one as well, both monsters to those around them, but also in their past memories of haunting and violence and abuse. Um, yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. It was very interesting. Um, yeah, I'd like to open it up. As SJ said, it's a really interesting film. I remember when it came out, I enjoyed it quite a bit, and I'm glad that somebody's working on it because I think it's interesting and it kind of reflects the opening comments about how how interesting the zombies becoming more regional outside of U.S. dominated narratives. And although it's a Netflix uh, film, it's very much a, a a Filipino, like you said, narrative, and it's interesting in that sense. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, Circa says thank you. I'm an Irish woman. Lots of monsters in our folklore and colonialism in our past and present, and a sociologist working with an indigenous community from Siberia, from whom both colonialism and folklore are also pertinent themes. So I'm particularly interested in your mentioning of colonialization and the choice of the zombie as opposed to an ashwang or other local Filipino monster figure in the film. Do you think this is an attempt to situate the monster of colonial colonization as other? If I remember correctly, you also mentioned the sympathy the zombie figure elicits. So maybe this is more complex. Would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, I also do think there's like a pretty close relationship between like indigenous Filipino and like also Irish like things. I've read a couple of things about that, but to answer your question, I find the relationship between humans and monstrous others just so fascinating, especially today when they're a lot more intertwined because of how monsters today, especially, are portrayed as more sympathetic than they were in the past. And so I think the film is on the one hand pointing to how like colonization and monsters are these other things. Like they're trying, like it's something to be pushed away, it's something bad, it's something evil. But at the same time, it's still deeply rooted in history in the country. And so as much as people try to push, like the characters, like people in general try to push these monsters, others, things away, it's so deeply intertwined that it becomes like you're pushing yourself away. So it's like this tension between how much can you other an other when part of what is being othered is part of yourself. Yeah.
Maybe if I unmute myself. Thank you, Circus. Chair, you had a question?
Yeah, I really loved your talk. Uh, I'm glad someone was working, like everyone said, I'm glad someone is writing on this movie. But I'm wondering, have you considered the history of the zombie in terms of sugar plantations? The fact that you mentioned the sugar plantations, and I was like, oh my gosh, yeah. Like, there's not only that history of colonial violence in the Philippines, but very much like in Haiti and the Caribbean as well. So these, like, the zombie actually comes from a very similar place, and I'm wondering if you talk about that at all in kind of the longer paper.
I haven't actually, but that is a good point because I think I did touch on it when I was like talking about like Western conceptions of zombies. I think my overall paper focused more on the question of like, why is it a zombie movie if there are like no zombies? But that is a really good direction I would like to take my dissertation in. Thank
Mhm.
you.
Oh, okay, yeah, great.
Okay. Gwen, did you have a question?
I had like half a thought. This is a great presentation and super interesting. I'm really interested in particular in your noting at as towards the end, especially that like so much of the movie is has the zombies as this separate force which is external to like the main plotting of the film, where like it's about the people more so than it is about like the zombies in particular, as I understood what you were saying. I guess like two things that I would want to know more about basically is like, is that, do you think that that decision in particular has anything to do with like you mentioned it a bit, but like that does have something probably to do with like the positioning of like colonial threats as like outside and sort of separate from like the human drama, possibly. I'm wondering if that's what you're saying. And then also, I'm wondering if that is typical of like um, Philippine monster narratives, I guess. Like if they are particularly typically from what you've read, like going to be the sort of canon that this director is drawing from, very monster focused, or treats the monsters as like a background for a human drama, I guess.
Mhm. Let me start by answering the second thing, just because I remember that more. But a lot of Filipino monster like media that I consumed, I consumed when I was like a kid, like watching the Filipino channel with my grandparents. So I actually don't know how much it relates to colonization. Because in my head, I'm thinking about like the superhero characters defeating all of the monsters. And so just on that kind of general level, it does seem to follow like a typical formula of like, oh, we're trying to like destroy the other, the monstrous. And even if it comes from like monsters of Filipino culture, there are some monsters who are considered bad, and we see that in a lot of the horror movies, but there are also some monsters who are a little bit more neutral and are actually useful for helping people fight the bigger bad guys. On Netflix also there's the show Trece. Um like she's like a detective in Manila and she also can see supernatural beings, and a lot of supernatural things happen that she's trying to like solve the case on. But one of her informants are an aswang. So in that case, the aswang is more of a neutral character, whereas like the other supernatural beings that she's trying to like stop from killing people are like big bad guys. Um, so I think it's more of like a mixed bag of like what the monsters represent as well as like their positionality in terms of like, are we trying to get rid of them or are we respecting them? Because with the Aswang especially, um, part of like the culture is when you're walking through like the woods or the forest and you're walking over something, you have to say tapi tapi po, which is like, excuse me, because if you don't respect the things that you're going over, then they're going to come and attack you. And I think this also kind of not is an homage to, but like I guess it's like a remnant of like indigenous Filipino culture before centuries of colonization, where the people worked with nature rather than in the, like the more Western way of dealing with the world, like separate from it. I don't remember your first question, but I hope that
I think you ended up answering it. Yeah,
okay.
that's really compelling. Thanks.
Okay, good. Is there anybody else has a question? If not, I do. Um, I just had, I don't know if it's a kind of a question of what you think, but when you're talking about the zombies when they do appear and they say the last thing that they said, I found that really interesting in the film as well, and was thinking about how it's different than like Pontypool, where in the film the zombies say the last thing they hear in kind of an absurd way. So it's in a way that's kind of a linguistic or way of being colonized linguistically, right? They succumb to this foreign language, English, right? And then that kind of drives them to zombieism, where what you're just describing seems to me that they retain a bit of themselves, even though it's kind of a still an indicator of that colonization. What if you had thought about that, or if you could just expand a bit more on that kind of language's identity and how that works with the zombies, because they are quite, their appearance is quite minimal, but what they do is really important, and that's one of the things that they do.
Yeah. I'm not too well versed in linguistics, but now that you do bring that up, I'm pretty sure all of the words that we hear from the zombies, like in the movie, have all been in English, and I do think that speaks to how like Tagalog is very much like Taglish now. Like it's very like, or I don't know how much everyone knows about like the relationship between Tagalog and English, but because of colonization, like English is more commonly spoken in the Philippines than Tagalog. So a lot of like Tagalog words and like all of the other dialects in the Philippines as well have become like less and less prominent in place of like combining their dialect or language with English like in the same sentence. And so maybe that was a stylistic choice to point to that because then if it was it's interesting, I think, to see that if zombies inspired from like American, like Western zombies are being brought to like this Filipino movie as like this monstrous figure, um, how the characters who become monsters are also their last words are in English rather than like in a Filipino language.
All right, which is interesting because you're talking about how the family, they have their own kind of trauma and issues, but the zombies then their trauma is kind of, cultural trauma is kind of overwritten by that English as colonial force. I'm just kind of obviously talking off the top of my head, but I think it's really thought-provoking, aspect and approach that you have to that, and that could be a very interesting, um, aspect that you could expand on and have quite interesting insights to provide through the thesis. So
Yeah, for sure.
yeah,
Definitely.
especially when, sorry, we have a comment here. That the question about linguistics reminds me discussions of hybridity and borders. Have you thought about that through your work yet?
Yeah, other chapters I had planned talk a little bit more about hybridity and borders, but that's also something I can add to this chapter for like more of a through line. Thank you.
Hmm. Great. Does anybody else have any comments or questions for Chelsea? Okay, perfect. That runs right up to our time. So thank you.